All right, good morning. When the announcements went, everybody realized Daryl wasn't going to be here. I thought I heard an audible sigh of, "Aw, is Joe?" Anyway, I'm going to work on this. This mic doesn't have a windsock, and so it's picking up a little bit of bumps, and Nick told me just don't sneeze and don't use the letter P. So, as we talk about the sermon today, and as I was asked to deliver it, I was told, hey, the theme that we're going to be going into is unity. It'd be great if you could preach about something on unity. And then Daryl, in one of his email backs, said, or just whatever it is that you think the Spirit lays on your heart to preach. And that was kind of his way of saying, or just kind of preach whatever it is that you want to preach if you don't want to stick with the topic of unity. And so that did give me some license to preach a topic that I've been thinking a lot about over the last couple of months. It's something that's kind of been on my mind and thoughts I've been putting together, and decided to go ahead and put that together. I will bring it around towards the end, towards the subject of unity, and tied in a little bit. It is not a Mother's Day sermon, so I apologize. Happy Mother's Day to all the mothers out there. I myself love my mother dearly and love her to death. She's taught me a lot over the years. One of the first things, and I'll mention this real quick about my mom. My mom was raised in an abusive family. Her stepfather that raised her was a drug dealer, very abusive to her sister, and physically, emotionally, mentally, the whole bit. And my grandmother, her mother, allowed all that to happen and had participated in some of the abuse. And my mom shared these stories with me when I was young about some of the abuse and things that she went through, things like being beaten with dog chains and having dishes broken over her head and her toes stomped on by her stepfather and with his hard wooden-soled shoes and things like that. And I didn't know him, but I knew my grandmother, and I said, how in the world could you, I remember I was like maybe 9. I said, how in the world could you love her? Could you ever, respect her? And she said, I never went to church. We didn't go to church, but I knew the Bible enough to know the 10 Commandments. And I knew that I was supposed to love my father and mother. And no matter what my mother did to me, I was determined that I was going to do what was right and love my mother. And that was an early lesson that I learned from my mom about forgiveness and about our focus towards God and how we need to do our best to live our best no matter how it is that other people treat us. And she's always taught me a lot of good lessons as life has gone on. And so hopefully you don't need a Mother's Day sermon. I think if you don't know that moms are special, I can't fix that level of cluelessness with the sermon. That probably has to be dealt with something more along the lines of a 2x4 to the head. So we're going to talk about something else. And what I want to do is as we go through the Scripture, I like to find people that I relate to as I hear stories of different figures in the Bible. And there's some figures in the Bible that I just honestly don't relate to very well that maybe other people do. We recently, in Bible class, we talked about Esther. I don't relate to Esther all that well. That story is not something that I can really relate to my life. There are New Testament figures that I can't really relate to very well. Paul the Apostle, this giant in the New Testament passages. But Paul, when you take a look at him in his writings, very dedicated, but when you read his stuff, he's very much driven by guilt. Here's a man that put innocent people to death and then seemed to live the rest of his life considering himself to be the worst sinner in the world, but trying to right that in ways. And when you look at John and John's writings, John almost seems to me to be a little full of himself in some of his writings. I love his writings. I love the books of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John and the things that he teaches there about love and whatnot, but you never see John make a mistake in any of his writings or any of the descriptions about John. However, there is a figure in the New Testament who's pretty well renowned that I tend to relate to a little bit better, and that's Peter. Now, Peter, in in Catholic tradition, Peter's second only pretty much to Jesus Christ himself. And a lot of traditions that people consider Peter to be the person that you meet at the gates of heaven that lets you in, right? There's an old saying, when you die, you meet Saint Peter, that kind of thing. But when you really take a look at Peter and Peter's life and ministry, Peter was a person that had a lot of ups and downs. Peter was a person that has a lot of really good intentions and falls far short of his good intentions. And this is something that I can relate to. This is something that when I see myself in my own life, this is something that I can point to and that gives me a little bit of strength and a little bit of hope for myself. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about Peter. I'm going to bring up the slide. So we're going to talk about the story of Peter here a little bit. We're going to start off pretty much at the beginning. And I'm going to go through, I'm not going to read all the passages that are up here. I'm going to do a lot of paraphrasing, but I listed the passages up there. So if you want to check my math and check my homework, you can go back after worship. There's a couple that I'll read through as we go through, and then we'll spend a little bit more time talking about a conversation that Christ has with Peter as we get a little closer to the end. But Christ and Peter meet on the shore of Galilee. And Peter's a fisherman. And Peter and his brother and some buddies, they're doing their job. They're out fishing, and it's the morning. They've been out fishing all night long. They haven't caught anything, and they're out cleaning their nets. And here comes Christ along, and Christ has got this press of people that are following him, that are wanting to listen to him, and they've seen him do some miracles, and they're just following him and mobbing him, and Christ is trying to create a little bit of separation from himself, and so he sees these empty boats sitting on the shoreline because these fishermen aren't using their empty boats, and so he steps into one of the boats to kind of back away from the people, and there's the fisherman right there, and this fisherman's name just happens to be Simon Peter, and he tells Peter, hey, push off away from the shore a little bit. And then Christ begins speaking. And after a while, as he's done, he looks at Peter and he basically says, what, you haven't caught any fish? And Peter's like, no, we haven't caught any fish. He says, well, throw your net in the water. And he's like, we have not caught any fish. Like, we were fishing all night and we didn't catch a single fish. And he says, throw your net in the water right now. And so Peter throws his net in the water. And they pull up this massive fish that's so big that he calls his friends over, his brother and his friends in their boats, and they haul it all up, and it's about ready to sink their ships. And so they drag these fish to shore, and Peter basically falls down, and he asks Christ to get away from him. He says, because I'm not worthy to be next to you. And Christ says, no, follow me, and I'll make you a fisher of men. And so this is how Christ begins now collecting his apostles, right? His first disciples. So this is the first way that we see Christ and Peter meeting. Now, as we go a little bit further on in the story, Peter again is out on the water with the rest of the disciples, and Christ isn't with them. And there's this storm going on. This is over in Matthew chapter 14. There's this storm going on, and it's night, and it's dark, and it's the worst place you want to be. Right, in the middle of a lake in bad weather. And all of a sudden they see a person walking across the water. And they're all terrified because who in the world walks across the water? Not unless you're a spirit or a ghost. And they're like, there's a ghost walking towards us on the water. And they're terrified. And Christ says, hey, it's me, Christ, don't be afraid. And Peter says, if you're really Christ, call me so that I can walk out on the water towards you. And so Christ says, come. And so Peter, in all of his enthusiasm, jumps out onto the water. He jumps out on the water and he starts walking towards Christ. And then the scripture tells us that Peter all of a sudden realized what it was that he thought he was doing. He looks down and it says he saw that the waves and the tempest were roaring underneath his feet. And he becomes afraid. And as soon as he becomes afraid, he sinks. And he looks at Christ and he says, Lord, help me. Lord, save me. And Christ reaches out his hand and pulls him up and pulls him back into the boat. And he says, oh, ye of little faith. Now you think, well, he had a lot of faith initially, right? He jumped out on that water and he was walking on the water. Well, of course, what Peter didn't really realize was he was walking on his faith. He wasn't really walking on the water. He wasn't really doing anything. He was walking on his faith. And then when he saw the storms of life, those storms raging underneath him, all of that faith, all that exuberance, all that confidence in Christ hit a stumbling block. He tripped up, right? And he begins to just be like we are all the time, fearful, right? How many times we go into our life and we think, I'm going to do great things. I've got all this energy for Christ. I want to do great things as a Christian. I want to feed the poor. I want to take care of the weak. I want to help the people who are in need. And then we see how tough things actually get. We see what the waves of life are actually like. We get a little scared about it, right? Maybe it's too much for us. And that faith starts to get weak. And we sink. But Christ, as always, is there to reach out to help us up when we ask Him to save us, so we can walk on His faith. We move on a little further in the story of Peter, and we get to Matthew chapter 16. And we see Peter here proclaiming his faith. Christ asked Peter this question. He says, "Who do men say that I am?" He's been walking around. Christ has been doing all these miracles. He's been teaching. He's got all these followers. He says, "Who do men say that I am?" And Peter says, well, some people think that you're Elijah. Some people think that you're John the Baptist. Some people think that you're these prophets. And he asks Peter, he says, well, who do you think that I am? And Peter says, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. You're the one who was foretold in prophecy. You're the Messiah. You are the King of kings and the Lord of lords, right? Doesn't say that, but this is what's inferred by saying that he is the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Christ there says that these famous words that get repeated all the time, and I say you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it, right? And this statement that Christ is the Son of the living God, the whole church should be built upon it. And so here is Peter making this proclamation. Matter of fact, Christ calls him blessed because he says, it's the Father that's shown this to you, Peter. He says, you're blessed. And so here Peter makes this great proclamation, this great statement that Christ uses to teach this foundational piece about the church. And then he turns it around and he immediately stumbles again. Because Christ says that, he says, hey, look, starts talking to the disciples and he says, we're going to end up going to Jerusalem and a lot of bad things are going to happen to me. Right? They're going to kill me. They're going to torture me. They're going to put me to death. They're going to persecute me. All these bad things are going to happen. And Peter, he gets really upset and he pulls Christ aside, and it says that he rebukes Christ. He says, don't say that. Don't say that. Like, I'm going to protect you. Like, I would never let this happen to you. And Christ looks at him and says, get thee behind me, Satan. Talk about a punch in the gut, right? Here you are. You think that Christ is like your best friend. Like, he is your friend. He's the dude that you follow. And you just told him that you would lay down your life for him to keep people from hurting him. And he looks at you and says, get behind me, Satan. He says, you're offending me. That's what Christ told Peter. And, here we see, though, what's going on with Peter. I mean, why would Christ be so upset? Because here, Christ says what he has to do, what's needed to be done. He gives his will. But what does Peter do? Peter wants to show his love for Christ the way that Peter thinks he should show his love for Christ. Not the way that Christ says that Peter should show his love for Christ. Right? And this ends up becoming a bit of a theme we'll talk about as we go through here, but I think we all oftentimes do that as well. We get very interested, or we have people in our lives, people that we love, and oftentimes we give them what we think they should need instead of what it is that they actually need, or they tell us that they need. Oftentimes we say things that are great, but they don't oftentimes actually help or do anything. And this, like I said, this will become a theme with Peter, as we'll see as we go through here. So we get to what comes now the passage of Christ on the Mount of Transfiguration, as it's called, in Matthew chapter 17. So Peter and James and John, they go up on the mountain with Christ, and they see this great sight. Christ is transfigured. And there's these figures of Jewish history. There's Moses and Elijah with Christ. And they're there on this mountain. They're talking to Christ. And they're down, Peter and James and John, they're down from the mountain. And they see all this happening. And it says they're transfigured. And what this actually means, when you take a look at this passage, they're glowing with light. These figures, including Christ, are glowing with light. It's shining off of them in rays. And what does Peter want to do? Peter says, I want to build you a temple, God. I want to build you a temple, Christ. Did Christ ask for a temple? No. Matter of fact, the voice from heaven comes down and tells Peter and James and John and says, this is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased. Hear ye him. Listen to him. And did he ask for a tabernacle? No. But that's what Peter wants to do to show his love for Christ. He wants to build a tabernacle. Now I move on to Matthew chapter 26 as we get close to the evening before Christ's death. And Christ says here that, hey, look, what's going to happen is everybody is going to be angry at me. Everybody is going to be really angry with me, and they're going to put me to death. Like, I'm going to die. And Peter says, Lord, that's not going to happen. Though everybody is angry at you, I would never be offended and angry by you. And in fact, I would die for you. Like, I would die for you. I would never let that happen before I let anybody hurt you. I would die for you. And Christ says, well, Peter, actually, you're going to deny me 3 times tonight. So, of course, Peter doesn't really think that'll happen, but here we go on a little bit further, and Christ says, hey, why don't you just come up with me to the top of the mountain and watch and wait while I pray. So he asks Peter and James and John, come with me to the top of the mountain and just watch and wait while I pray. For an hour. You just have to watch and wait for 1 hour while I pray. And Christ goes up to the mountain to pray, and he comes back down. Peter's asleep. And Christ says, you couldn't even stay awake for an hour. Peter, you just got done telling me that you would give your life before you let anybody hurt me, that you would die before you let anybody hurt me, and you can't even stay awake for 1 hour when I ask you to stay awake for me. How in the world would you be willing to die for me, right? So Christ says, you need to watch and pray lest you fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. That's what he tells Peter. So we move on a little bit further now. A little bit after they come down from the mountain, and what happens? Here comes the mob to get Christ. Christ has already told Peter, hey, I am going to die. You need to let this happen. Remember the get thee behind me, Satan? Peter, you need to let this happen. This is what has to happen. But the mob comes to get Peter, and what does Peter do? Pulls out a sword. Christ, you're my best friend. I'm going to defend you. I'm going to pull out this sword, and I'm going to fight for you. And he cuts off the servant of the high priest's ear. And what does Christ do? He tells Peter, put away your sword. Picks up the ear, heals the servant of the high priest, right? And then Christ gets taken away. And what does Peter do? Does he fight? No. It says he follows behind from a distance. We move on a little bit further now, and what happens? Matthew chapter 26. As Christ is taken away and he's beaten, as he's being tortured, as he's being whipped to the point of near death. And people are looking at Peter and saying, weren't you one of the ones that was with him? Aren't you a Galilean? Weren't you one of the ones that followed him? 3 times he denies Christ. Matter of fact, it goes to the point where it says that he was swearing, denying Christ, cursing. And as he does the 3rd time, Christ told him, 3 times before the cock crowed, he would deny him 3 times. That was exactly what he did. And as he denies him, he remembers what it is that Christ says, and he went away weeping. He realized that he had done the thing that he swore not to do. The exact opposite of what he swore he was going to do. He betrayed his friend. Now, I think there's a lot of us that can relate to that, right? There's a lot of us who've had friends, have been great friends, or in times that we haven't been great friends. Times that we've had people that we loved and we thought we would do anything for, that we end up letting them down. I think there's those of us that have had the same thing happen in the other way, where we've had friends that we thought were great friends that ended up letting us down. They end up betraying us in times, and we've done the same thing ourselves. And you think about the pain that causes, right? When you don't live up to your own expectations, when you have built yourself up to the point where you think, man, I would do anything for that person. How about our relationship and our walk with God? We think, Lord, I love you. Lord, you gave your life for me. Lord, you died to save my sins. I will do anything that you ask me to do. And then the Lord gives us something to do. And we're oftentimes really quick to suddenly find an excuse, right? Suddenly find a reason why I can't quite go do that thing right now. Give me something else to do. The Lord needs me to forgive somebody that needs my forgiveness. The Lord needs me to go out of my way to help somebody that needs my help. The Lord needs me to do something hard that's inconvenient. And suddenly we've got all kinds of reasons why we shouldn't do it, or we can't do it. And we don't do the thing that it is that we know we should do. Maybe times when we've been in conversations with people who are mocking the Lord. And that's all over the place these days, right? And we don't step up to proclaim Him as ours. Not necessarily to have an argument, not to fight people with swords and get out there and be mean and be petty back or anything else like that, but just to acknowledge that we are His. But we stay quiet and don't do it. Right? All these ways that we ourselves don't live up to the expectations that we set in our high points when we say, Lord, I'll do anything for you. I'd give my life for you. And we don't do that. You know, a lot of you remember these stories of when ISIS was going through Syria and the Christians who were being sacrificed, who were sacrificing themselves, giving their lives, being beheaded, being tortured, being murdered, as ISIS was coming through Syria and cleansing it of Christians. And it made me stop and pause and think, as that was going on, you know, how good we have it in this country. That's not something we even really think about. But would I be that strong? Would I be that strong in my faith and my love for Christ if that was me in that position? Right? It's hard. That's tough. Peter thought he was. Peter thought he could. But at this point in time in his life, he couldn't. And he didn't. And Christ is crucified. Now we come to Christ's resurrection, after Christ is raised from the dead. And we get to John chapter 21. And at this point in time, Christ has showed himself to the apostles twice. And he's appeared in a room with them and showed them to himself, but he hasn't really had a whole lot of conversations with them individually. And here's Peter. Peter now has the opportunity to try to do something to make things right. Peter knows what he's done. Peter knows he's betrayed this person that he loves. He knows he's denied him. He knows he hasn't done what it was that he asked him to do. And this has to be hurting Peter. So Peter and some of the other disciples, they're out on the lake. And they're standing by the lake shore. And we get to the beginning of chapter 21. And Peter says, I'm going fishing. And, you know, that's what he does for a trade, but, you know, it's also probably some of the things you do just to clear your mind. Peter says, I'm going fishing. And he gets in a boat with some of the other apostles that are there with him in their boats, and they set out. And they're out on the water, and they fish all night long, and they don't catch anything. And so after a while, there's this person on the beach This person on the beach says, hey, have you caught anything? And they say, nope, haven't caught anything. And he says, cast your net on the other side of the boat. I'm like, okay, that's stupid. Right? I mean, I've spent plenty of time, I've spent plenty of hours jigging a line off of one side of the boat. And if somebody would have told me, hey, if you haven't caught anything for the last 12 hours, why don't you just jig your line off the other side of the boat, maybe you'll catch something. Right? This doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But this is basically what this person says. Throw your nets on the other side of the boat. So they throw their nets on the other side of the boat, and they pull up this great mass of fish, so much that it's going to tear the nets. And John says, that's the Lord on the shore. And Peter responds by diving into the water. Peter jumps into the water and rushes to the shore, which I'm sure was the delight of all of his friends who now had to pull up all these fish and leave them to row back up to the shore. But Peter jumps in the water to go to Christ. And it does say that he ends up helping his friends dragging this net up. And they get there, and Christ is already cooking fish to make them breakfast. And they go and they sit down to eat. And then they have this conversation. We'll take a look at this conversation here. John chapter 21, beginning in verse 15, it says, so when they had dined, Jesus says to Simon Peter, Simon, son of Jonas, lovest thou me more than these? So I believe that when he says these that he's talking about are these other men, these other friends that he has around him. Lovest thou me more than these? And he says to him, yea, Lord, yes, you know that I love you. And he says to him, feed my lambs. Verse 16, Christ says to him again the second time, Simon, son of Jonas, lovest thou me? The third time he says to him the third time, Simon, son of Jonas, lovest thou me? Peter was grieved. I put in brackets there, sorrowful. That's what that word grieve means. Because he said to him the third time, lovest thou me? And he says to him, Lord, thou knowest all things. Thou knowest that I love thee. Jesus says to him, feed my sheep. So this is a conversation that really kind of explains all of Peter's problems, his issues. You don't really see it because this story is horrible to read in English. It's much better to read in Greek. And so to understand this, I'm going to give you just a quick lesson for those of you who don't know and aren't familiar with some Greek words. English language is really a horrible language for being able to express yourself and express yourself clearly. We do a lot of stupid things with words where we use the same word with multiple meanings, and then we invent more meanings for that word as we go along. You know, like I can say with the word man, it's a male person, or I can say, oh, man, or I can say man, or I can say, you know, it's the same thing with dude, or I can do it with a cool, right? A bunch of words. We have all these kinds of things. Well, the word love is also one of these words that we don't do well in English. Because I can say, you know, I love you, and that might mean something differently depending on who I'm talking to. And the context of who I'm talking to defines what that word love really means. And we have this problem, like even when you like when you start dating or you've got somebody that you like and you're just like, I like you, but do you like me? Or, you know, I love you, but do you love me? I mean, we don't know how to say the word love very well, but Greek has got multiple words for different kinds of love. And so it's much clearer in how it's discussed. One of the primary ones that's used in the New Testament is the word agape, and I think a lot of us are familiar with. And the word agape just means to put the object of your love first, before you, that you take care of that person. That's one of the primary words used. The second most familiar word that's used in the Scripture, in the New Testament, is the word phileo, which really denotes by itself a friendship or a strong friendship. And when Strong's, it's a language expert. Basically, I'm not a Greek language expert, but when Strong's talks about these two words, he basically says you can think of kind of agape as being a decision. It's something from the mind. Like you decide you are going to put somebody else's needs first, whereas phileo is more of an emotional. It's something of the heart. And of course, there's, other words there. Eros, which is a romantic love. It's where we get our word erotic from, right? That's the love between a man and a woman, husband and wife. And then the word phileo becomes a suffix that changes with the prefix that you use for it as well. So you can describe all kinds of different kinds of love with this prefix, suffix kind of thing, where you can say a word we're very familiar with, Philadelphia, or Philadelphos, which is, we call it brotherly love, right? This is, phileo is love, Delphi, Delphos is brothers, and so it's like the love between brothers. Philostorgos is family, and so Philostorgos is the love that you'd experience between members of a family, between your mom, your dad, brothers, sisters, cousins, aunts, uncles, that kind of thing. Philoxenos, xenos is stranger. Like we've heard of xenophobia before, fear of strangers, fear of people who are different, xenophobia. Well, philoxenos is a love of strangers, and that's generally translated as hospitality in the Scripture, right? So there's all these different kinds of ways that we can describe how we feel love or show love towards somebody in the Greek, whereas just in English we say the word love. And so when we get to this, conversation between Christ and Peter, there's different words for love that are used as you go through this conversation. And unless you kind of understand what those words are, you don't really get the conversation and why Christ asks this question 3 times. Actually, he asks the same question twice and then a completely different question the 3rd time, but you lose it in the English and you catch it in the Greek. And so I'm going to break that down here a little bit because it helps us understand Peter's thinking. So verse 15, so when they had dined, Jesus says to Simon Peter, Simon, son of Jonah, agapeo thou me more than these? So he is asking Peter, Peter, are you going to put me first? Would you put me first before everybody else? Right? Obey my word, do the things I ask you to do, put me first before everybody else. And Peter replies back and says, Lord, you know that I phileo thou you. He doesn't answer Christ's question. Christ asks agape. Peter says, Lord, you know that you are my friend. Like, I am your best friend. Like, I really, really like you. Like, I am your best friend. I know I didn't show it when I denied you, but I really am your friend. Peter thinks that these two things are the same. Like, he thinks, hey, if Christ is my best friend, then obviously I'm going to put him first, right? That's the way it should be. But it's not answering the question. And Christ says, feed my lambs. And then Christ comes back a second time and asks him the same question. Simon, will you put me first? Will you show me agape love? And Peter says, Lord, you know that I phileo you. I just told you. Like, I just told you this. Like, I am your best friend. Then Christ comes back the 3rd time, and the 3rd time he changes the question. The 3rd time Christ says, Peter, are you my best friend? Do you phileo me? And then it says, Peter was grieved. Why? Because Christ changed the question. He says, because Christ said the 3rd time, phileo thou me. Because when Christ changes the question, Peter understands that he's missing the point. Peter understands he's missing the point. He didn't answer the question the right way, right? He didn't answer what Christ was asking. When Christ says, hey, you're going to put me first, he says, you know you're my friend. No, Peter, you're going to put me first. You know you're my best friend. Peter, am I really your best friend? And then Peter comes back and says, Lord, you know all things. You know that I'm your friend. You know that I'm your best friend. And then Christ comes back to Peter and he says, I think you're going to understand this a little bit better a little bit later. And we'll finish with the rest of this conversation in a second. But Peter here, this conversation now has a whole different meaning when you kind of see it in Greek and kind of the way that it goes. But you understand some of Peter's problems, right? Here's this Peter through all this time, his time with Christ, where he's tried to be the friend, right? What does a friend do? A friend goes and defends you. They stand by your side, right? When you need something, they go get it for you. They do all those things that friends do to take care of each other. But what Christ needed was somebody to do what he asked them to do. What he asked them to do. Not what Peter thought he needed to do as Christ's friend. So, let's take a look at these two things a little bit, because both of them are actually important. Because we could walk away from this and say, well, what's really important is that we have an agape love for Christ and not this phileo, friendship kind of love. Well, no, not really. We see here an agape love for Christ is something that we need to have. Matthew chapter 22, Christ says, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and all thy mind, right? That love is the word agape, right? We need to be putting Christ first with all our heart, our soul, and our mind. John chapter 14, verses 15, 21, and 23. Christ says in verse 15, if you love me, if you agape me, keep my commandments, right? If we're going to put him first, we need to do the things that Christ asks us to do. Verse 21, Christ says, he that hath my commandments and keepeth them, he it is that loves me, right? So again, if we're going to put Christ first, if we're going to have that agape love for him, we keep his commandments. Verse 23, Jesus answered him and said, if a man loves me, agape me, he will keep my words, and my Father will love him, and we will come unto him and make our abode with him. So this relationship with Christ, showing our agape love for Christ, means we will do the things that he asks us to do, right? We will put his needs and interests first before our own. But phileo is also important. We see this as well. Matthew chapter 10, verses 37 through 39, Christ speaking uses the word phileo. Christ says, he who is a friend, phileo, he that, in English, that verse reads, he that loveth the father, he that loveth his father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. That word there is phileo, not agape. And it says, he that loveth, or phileo, his son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And that's about loyalty, right? Friendship is oftentimes about loyalties and statement of loyalties. If somebody tells you, even a family member tells you, hey, if you're going to be a Christian and follow Christ, then you can't be my friend. Or like, you're no longer part of this family. We used to see that down in, the Jews lived that in the Christian era, right? I mean, if you became a Christian, you were pretty much excommunicated from your Jewish family. And so, people live that kind of thing. We see friendship with Christ is required for salvation. 1 Corinthians 16:22, Paul says, if a man loves not, and that word love is phileo, loves not the Lord Jesus Christ, let him be anathema maranatha, which just means separated forever. Here in John chapter 16 and verse 27, he says, for the Father himself loves you, that word is phileo. He's your friend. God is your friend because you loved me, Christ says. You've made me your friend. And have believed that I came from God. So again, there's this relationship of love as friendship with God and us and with Christ. And it's also shown by our obedience. Christ says in John chapter 15, this is my commandment, that you love one another, agape, as I have loved you. Greater agape love has no man than this, than he laid down his life for his friends, phileo or philos. You are my friends, if you do whatsoever I have commanded you. Herefore I call you not servants, for the servant knows not what the Lord does, but I have called you friends, philos, for all things I have heard of the Father I have made known unto you. This passage was always kind of strange to me until I became a senior military officer. Because it was like, wow, that's kind of really strange. Like, hey, you're only going to be my friend. That's like the kid who says you're only going to be the friend if you play the games that they want to play, right? Like, you can be my friend, but I get to boss you around. And that's kind of the way that passage sounds, right? Until I became a senior military officer, and I have people working for me that I really like, and I'm very close to. And there's a lot of folks that have worked for me in the past, that other military members that are and have been great friends of mine. And still are, and we keep in contact all the time and everything else like that. But when they worked for me, and they were a good friend and we were close, if I would have asked them to do something as their boss, and they didn't do it, like, that really kind of would have been stabbing me in the back as my friend and anything else like that, right? And that's why I kind of understand this. Yeah, Christ, I mean, he's our boss. He's Christ, right? He's the creator of the world. But he wants to be your friend. At the same time, when he says, he's in this position of power, and he says, hey, you need to do this. If I was to be like, no, I mean, I get it, we're friends, but I don't have to do that. Like, that's really kind of stabbing him in the back. I understood that when like I said, when I reached the position in my life that I'm in much more clearly. And that's what he's talking about here. And then, going back to Exodus chapter 33 and verse 11, this verse always stood out with me. This is about between Moses and God. And this is after the children of Israel have made their golden calf, and God has moved his presence outside the camp, and Moses builds this whole new tabernacle to visit God outside the camp. And when Moses gets up to go talk to God, the people aren't allowed to be around God's presence anymore, so they stand up and they watch him go. And Moses goes over to this other tabernacle outside the camp, and there the presence of God as a pillar of cloud meets him. In Exodus chapter 33, verse 11, it says, and the Lord spoke to Moses face to face as a man speaketh unto his friend. That passage to me has always been remarkable. Like, he doesn't speak to Moses as the great God on high that's commanding down something. He speaks to Moses face to face as a friend. And that always strikes me as that's the way that God wants us to speak to him. Yes, we're reverent. Yes, he's our father. But do you speak to God like he's your harsh, abusive father? Right? Or do you speak to God as you would a friend? Like your dad, right? That you're close to, that you can have a conversation with. Or do we revere him as this harsh, abusive, distant kind of father figure, right? And that's not the way God wants us. He wants us to be able to speak to him face to face as to a friend. So we come back to this conversation. Christ foretells that Peter's going to eventually learn agape. As we go into the rest of the verses in this chapter, and I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to paraphrase them quick. Matter of fact, I left the verses off of there. But basically, what ends up happening is Christ says, you know what's going to happen, Peter? He says, what's going to happen is, as you go into the future, people are going to bind your hands and take you where you don't want to go. And it says he said this, indicating the manner that Peter was going to die for Christ. So Christ says, Peter, you know what? You are going to learn agape. You are going to give yourself and sacrifice yourself for me. And then, of course, what does Peter do? Peter turns around, he sees John, and he says, well, what's that guy going to do? And Christ says, you know what? If he gets to live forever, what does it matter to you? You follow me. And Peter's like, well, no, but what about that guy? And he's like, no, listen, you follow me. You just focus on you and you follow me. You show me agape love. So as we go through Peter's life, we roll into the book of Acts, and here he is, a leader of the church, right? We get into Acts chapter 2, and he's preaching sermons, and we get into Acts chapter 5 and chapter 6, and he's being persecuted, and he's being thrown in jail, and he's standing up in front of the Sanhedrin, and he's saying things like, it is better to follow God than follow man. And he's telling these people to their face about how they crucified God, and he's being beaten, he's being whipped, and he's being thrown in jail to the point where there are points when the other Christians thought he was dead. We get to chapter 10, and he's the apostle that Christ comes to and shows that all Gentiles can be saved, that Gentiles are no longer unclean. The Jews and Gentiles are the same. And he's the first one to convert a Gentile and baptize a Gentile. Well, then we get over to, so we think now maybe Peter's made it, right? Here he is. He's a leader of the church. He's been persecuted. He's been beaten. He's made it, right? He's a strong Christian. He's finally where we all want to be. And then Paul tells us a story about Peter in the book of Galatians and in chapter 2. And Paul says, you know, when I was up at Antioch, which is a Gentile city, he says, Peter and some of the other leaders of the Jewish church in Jerusalem, they came up to visit. And when we all sat down to eat, Peter had been eating with us, but as soon as he saw the other Jews who didn't really like Gentiles, as soon as he saw their clique sitting somewhere else, he got up and walked over to their clique and pretended like he didn't know us. And Paul says, I had to get up and call Peter out to his face and rebuke him and say, Peter, you don't even follow the Old Testament laws, so why is it that you're judging all these Gentiles who aren't following the Old Testament laws? So here you got Peter. Now, what does he do? He slips back into sin because of his own pride. He wants his clique. He's worried about how he looks in front of his Jerusalem clique, in front of his Jewish buddies. And so he steps into that clique and creates a stumbling block for these Gentile Christians when he was the first one to convert Gentiles. So even as a strong Christian, even as somebody who's a leader in the church, even as somebody who shouldn't be going astray that you would think is, above these kind of temptations now. Nope. You can still stumble. You can still sin. You can still have struggles and troubles. Well, what do we learn from Peter? Peter, tradition tells us, ended up dying, being crucified upside down for Christ. He gave his life for Christ. You can have these struggles and stumbles as a Christian. You can have times when you think you got all this faith and then you fall short of where it is that you need to be. You can have these times when you think that you love Christ more than anything else. And then when he's asked you to do what it is you need to do, you fall short. You can have those times. And you can have great highs when you do the things you know you need to be doing. You're going to go through those ups and downs. And it can still work itself out in the end. You just keep pushing along. You just keep trying to do those things that God has called you to do. So get back to the source of unity here real quick. We'll finish up this way, hitting the unity piece. Let's go back to that conversation. I think there's a couple of things here that you can see that we can all be unified in as Christians. Number one, we all need to love Christ, right? We all need to be friends with Christ. We should all love Christ. He died for us. He sacrificed himself for us, for you, for me, so that we wouldn't have to bear the burden of our own sins. We can love him like a friend, like a best friend for that. We need to have agape love for Christ where we put him first. We can all be unified in that love for Christ. But notice the command that Christ gives Peter after each of these things. He says, feed my sheep. Actually, he says it, King James translates it, feed my sheep. Other translations get it a little bit better. The first time it was feed my sheep. The second time he actually says, tend to my lambs. And then the third time he says, again, feed my sheep. So this idea of take care of each other. Take care of each other. Feed each other. Take care of each other. Look out for each other. Like we can be unified in that. Right? Those are some basic things we can all come around and come together on as a church, as Christians, as a congregation, no matter where we're from, no matter our history. We can come together on the basics of loving Christ and taking care of each other. Thank you all today. Have a blessed day. Have a happy Mother's Day.